This is Joe narrating a PowerPoint in Social Studies. It's from the unit on Geography in the World, Lesson 5, Humans and the Environment, found on page 478 in the Kaplan book. This lesson is going to talk about population shifts, how they affect the environment, both positively and negatively. Some new vocabulary, which is probably not really new to most of us. It talks about the difference between native peoples and immigrants. And then as far as population density and environment, it talks about urban, suburban, or rural. If we go back in time, on this map we can see three different human species and their migration patterns out of Africa. For example, in yellow you see the species Homo erectus, which developed in Africa and then migrated out of Africa as far as Eastern Asia. That species then became extinct. They were followed by Homo neanderthalensis, what we call Neanderthals. They came out of Africa, settled in the Middle East and Europe, and then they also became extinct. The only living human species is Homo sapiens in red, and you can see that they developed in Africa. About 200,000 years ago they left Africa and moved into Europe and eastward towards India and Asia, eventually getting as far as Australia about 50,000 years ago, into New Zealand 1,500 years ago, and made it across the land bridge between Asia and North America 15,000 years ago, and from there down into the United States and South America. This is a current map of the United States showing population density. So the darker and bluer an area is, the more densely populated it is. That means that there are more people per given area, for example, a square mile. If you look on the two coasts, you'll see that there's dark blue, which means there's more dense population, especially on the east coast. And then towards the western center of our country, there's a lot of yellow, which means that it's not that densely populated. The little demarcations within the states are the counties. So the dark black lines mark off the borders of the states, and the fainter lines mark off the counties in each state. So this data could be determined from census data that the United States collects every 10 years. Here's a similar map of the United States. This time the colors are have a reddish tint, and the darker the color, the more densely populated it is. The state borders are drawn in black, and you can see the numbers in each state represent the ranking of the population density. On the right hand side you can see New Jersey is the most densely populated state. It gets a number 1. Rhode Island gets a 2. Massachusetts a 3. Pennsylvania is 9th as far as population density. This is a combination bar graph and line graph, looking at years in decades on the x-axis from 1850 to 2010. So each bar represents one decade, and the numbers on the bar show the foreign-born population in millions living at that time in the United States. So for example, in 1850 there were 2.2 million foreign-born people in the United States, and in 2010 there were 40 million foreign-born people in the United States. This has a line graph as well. The line represents the percent of the total populations made up by foreign-born people. Again, in 1850 9.7% of the people living in the United States were foreign-born. It dipped as low as 4.7% in 1970s. And now it's back up to 12.9%. So you can see that there's changes in the immigration patterns into the United States. This slide includes both immigrants who moved here legally and those who are undocumented. Many people migrate to another country due to job opportunities or other economic reasons. Sometimes they move to another country out of pressure to leave their native country, for example, from war, from poverty, from famine, from disease, from natural disasters. So for example, if you look at this line graph, on the x-axis you have the years marked off every 5 years from 1825 to 1890, and on the y-axis you have numbers of people from 50,000 up to 250,000. And this graph shows the Irish immigrants to the United States. So this shows how many Irish immigrants moved to the United States each year. And you can see that there's a distinct change around 1850 when almost 250,000 Irish people came to the United States. What was driving this was the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. The Irish depended heavily on potatoes as a food crop. A fungus destroyed the potato crops in the 1840s, leaving many people without food. Many Irish died, many immigrated to other countries, including the United States. Another example of population shifts is the situation in India after World War II. India was made up of a majority Hindu population. There was a substantial Muslim minority population. When India declared independence in 1948, it was decided that there would be relocation of the Muslim population and the Hindu population so as to avoid conflict. So many Hindus moved out of the areas that are now Bangladesh and West Pakistan, and many Muslims who are living on the subcontinent of India moved from India, current day India, into West Pakistan and what was then called East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. So there were substantial population shifts within a region due to conflict. Another reason for population shifts mentioned in the book is the state of Israel. This bar graph shows the years 1914 to 2005 on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the population going in million people increments from 1 million to 6 million. So if you look at 1914, you see that there were about 900,000 people living in what is now Israel, which is then called Palestine, and about 7.6% of them were Jews. The remaining population was mostly Arabs. And then the numbers of people, both Jews and Arabs, in that region increased, and the percentage of Jews increased, so that by 2005, 50.7% of the people living in Palestine were Jewish, and almost the same number of people, percentage-wise, were Arabs. This was driven by the recognition by the Jews that they wanted a nation of their own due to continuous persecution over centuries when they were living in other countries. Also, you can see around the 1950s, the percentage of Jews increased much more rapidly. Israel declared itself a independent nation in 1948, and more Jews immigrated to this nation. Your book talks about the difference between urban, suburban, and rural. We're all familiar with an urban environment if we live in Philadelphia. In urban environments, there's more population density, there's multi-family housing, there are often many jobs and job opportunities in different fields. In a suburban environment, they tend to be on the areas surrounding a city. There are often single-family houses. People have yards. They have cars because they need them to get around. They can't walk to supermarkets. And there is lower population density. In a rural environment, there's even less population density. So farms and housing might be miles apart in some parts of the nation. So humans, everywhere they go, consume resources like water, and they produce waste in the form of pollution. So this graph here shows population density versus, on the y-axis, carbon dioxide emissions, that's CO2 emissions per person. So cities have tend to have a higher population density, so they would be on the right-hand side of this diagram. Rural areas tend to have less population density, they would be on the left. But the red line shows the average CO2 emissions per person, and this is highest in the suburban regions where the population density is in between. So people in cities tend to make fewer carbon dioxide emissions per person. Cities do have higher pollution rates because there's more people, but per person it's much more efficient to have people living in cities as far as the CO2 emissions per person. And this makes sense because people in cities tend to drive less, they use public transportation, they do live in multifamily housing units which are easier to heat, and other reasons. That's it for lesson 5 on page 470.